Hi and welcome to a story about art history for beginners. In this video, we'll go through several of the most important periods in art history, from cave paintings all the way to today. By the end of this video, you'll understand how art could go from realistic masterpieces to abstract shapes, and even a plain black square. But let's start from the beginning. The first kind of art we know of is cave paintings. Many of them are over 17,000 years old. The paintings often show animals of various kinds. No one knows exactly what the images meant, but it's believed they were used to tell stories, bring luck in hunting, or express spirituality. Ancient Egyptian art was filled with symbols. It told stories of gods, pharaohs, and the afterlife. The images were flat, without depth. Faces in profile, bodies from the front, to show every detail clearly. The Venus de Milo is a famous statue from ancient Greece. It represents Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Almost all art from ancient Greece was based on myths and legends from Greek mythology. Much of the art was painted on objects, like clay pots. The figure in the image is Odysseus from Greek mythology. But was this really art? That might sound like a strange question, but the concept of art didn't actually exist back then. The Greeks saw it as regular craftsmanship, like making shoes or building a chair. In the Middle Ages, art was mostly about Christianity. The church commissioned nearly all of it, so the images were deeply religious. Paintings were flat and unrealistic, but that didn't matter. The goal was clear: to tell the stories of the Bible to those who couldn't read. Now we enter the Renaissance. This painting is called The Birth of Venus, by the Italian artist Sandro Botticelli. Venus is a goddess from Roman mythology. During the Renaissance, artists rediscovered the stories of ancient Greece and Rome. One of the most famous men from the Renaissance was Leonardo da Vinci, who painted the Mona Lisa. He was seen as a genius and had many different talents. Da Vinci wanted paintings to look more realistic than they had during the Middle Ages. He worked in a way that merged art and science. Details were important, and he studied things like the human body to be able to imitate it as accurately as possible. Something big is also happening. During the Renaissance, artists start experimenting with perspective, giving their images a sense of depth and realism. Compared to ancient Egyptian art, the difference is striking. Those earlier images look flat and two-dimensional. During the Baroque era, art changed again. Artists used strong contrasts between light and shadow to create powerful images, often depicting dramatic religious scenes. One of the most famous artists of the Baroque era was Artemisia Gentileschi. She painted powerful, independent women, something rarely seen at the time. It was incredibly difficult for women to be recognized as artists. Most were denied access to art schools and weren't allowed to exhibit their work. But despite every obstacle, Gentileschi rose to become one of the most celebrated painters of her time. This is also when self-portraits started to appear. Artists began painting themselves. Art was no longer just about mythology or religion. It became a way to express oneself. People began to talk about art for art's sake during the 19th century. What does that mean? It means that art didn't need a practical function or even a message. It could exist just for its own sake. Suddenly, artists no longer needed to paint kings, battles, or religious stories. They could create whatever they wanted, simply because it felt right. And that idea changed how people thought about art. During Romanticism, landscapes became a subject of their own. Previously, nature had mostly been a background for religious or historical scenes. Now, nature was shown as wild and powerful, and humans were portrayed as small in a vast and mysterious world. At this time, artists also began to earn a living in new ways. In the past, artists like Da Vinci received commissions from wealthy families or royalty. But now, they started creating the art they wanted, and selling it to anyone who was interested. Caspar David Friedrich was one of the first artists to work this way. It gave him more freedom, since no one told him what to paint. Realism emerged as a reaction to the emotional paintings of Romanticism. Instead, realists wanted to depict things exactly as they were. No exaggerations. they started painting ordinary people instead of kings or mythological figures. This was also around the time that photography was invented. Realist painters were inspired by it. This image is the first surviving photo taken with a camera in 1826. Impressionists used color in a whole new way. It was okay to see brushstrokes and blobs of paint. They wanted to capture the impression or feeling of a moment, rather than painting perfectly like in Romanticism. Expressionists painted in a similar loose style, but took it even further. They didn't paint nature. They wanted to show how we feel on the inside. One example is The Scream by Edvard Munch, where the colors and shapes enhance the feeling of anxiety and fear. Cubism was an art style where images were broken down into geometric shapes, like cubes and angled surfaces. Picasso, inspired by African art, used simplified and angular forms, breaking completely from traditional ways of painting. The paintings had no clear story, no realistic perspective, and were far from perfect. It caused strong reactions. People wondered if it was even allowed to paint like this. Now let's talk about abstract art. Abstract or non-representational art doesn't try to show reality or imitate how things look. Hilma af Klint was a Swedish artist who painted abstract art long before it became popular. She used bold colors and geometric shapes to express emotions and ideas, rather than painting real-life subjects like people or landscapes. Black Square by Kazimir Malevich, painted in 1915, is a hugely important abstract work. Malevich wanted to show that art didn't need to depict anything real. Color and form could be art in themselves. He replaced old ideas like depth and perspective with a completely flat surface. The black square became like an infinite space, yet still limited by the white area around it. A whole new idea of what art could be. Marcel Duchamp was a major figure in Dadaism, and he created what he called ready-mades. That means he took everyday objects and presented them as art. One example is his piece Fountain, where he exhibited a urinal and called it art. People were shocked and outraged. Is this really art? They were used to art looking more like this. Pop art was a reaction against complicated and too serious art. Instead, pop artists drew inspiration from popular culture, advertising, comic books, and everyday items, things that weren't seen as high art. For artists working with conceptual art, it's the idea behind the artwork that matters, not just how it looks. Art should make us think, not just be something pretty to look at. Art doesn't have to be a painting. The artist can use themselves, their actions, or their body as part of the artwork. That's called performance art. The Artist is Present is a famous performance by Marina Abramovic. She sat still on a chair at the museum, 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 months. Visitors took turns sitting opposite her, silently meeting her gaze. No one could speak or touch her. The only thing happening was the eye contact between artist and visitor. Postmodern art is often about questioning old ideas of what real art is and who gets to be called an artist. Artists began challenging the idea that art had to be perfect, unique, or made by a genius. Basically everything the great masters from earlier eras stood for. Today, art is everywhere. We see street art in our cities, feminist art advocating for equality, and AI-generated art created with the help of computers. To sum up, I'd like to answer the question I asked at the beginning. How did art go from perfectly painted images to just a black square? It was because artists began to question traditional art and explore new ways to express themselves. From being about gods and myths to ideas and emotions, art began to exist for its own sake, not just to represent reality. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel.